I'm very excited for this conversation. And I just want to do a round of introductions. Marc Hauser with Hauser Advisory is lead this interview of two experts who can help us navigate the rescheduling, descheduling, uh, complexity, process issues, trying to understand more. But Marc Hauser is the president of Hauser Advisory. He's widely recognized as one of the leading advisors to the US cannabis industry. Prior to consulting, Marc practiced deal and capital markets for nearly 25 years, a lot of those years with Sam Zell, if I'm correct, who I believe was a big fan of cannabis as well.
I,
And yes,
I can neither confirm nor deny that.
yeah, yeah,
As that would be attorney-client privilege and
yeah.
confidential, of course.
That's right.
So
And most recently, he was the chair of the cannabis practice team at Reed Smith, the global law firm. He's also the author of a Substack that I love to read called Cannabis Musings and an associate professor at Northwestern University School of Law. And Marc, you'll be helping. Thank you for agreeing to help me navigate through so I don't sound too dumb with two awesome people that I'm really grateful to both of you for agreeing to do this. First, I'd like to introduce is Shane Pennington, who's a partner in the litigation department of Porter Wright, Morris, and Arthur in their DC office, where he counsels clients on federal regulatory issues involving a number of industries, including energy, pharmaceuticals, for our purposes, controlled substances, aviation, and agriculture. He was a former law clerk to federal judges on the DC Court, Fifth Circuit, and DC District Court. Um, he There is a number of other things that I can go into. One of my favorite things that Shane does is I don't know if you know this, Shane, but I am a paid subscriber to your newsletter on drugs. And I will put that in the notes for the interview of how you can subscribe to both Marc's newsletter and also Shane's. Both, I think, are kind of required reading if you're interested in the cannabis industry, if you're in the cannabis industry, you're an investor, et cetera. And our last guest, but not least, is Howard Sklamberg, who is a partner at Arnold Porter, where he counsels clients on a wide range of compliance and enforcement issues related to the US FDA, Food and Drug Administration. And what's most important to our conversation is not only what Howard does, but what he's done in the past. He's held a variety of roles at the FDA from 2010 to 2017, including being Deputy Commissioner for Global Regulatory Operations and Policy. That meant that he directed an office in the FDA of over 5,000 employees in more than 200 offices. And as Deputy Commissioner, he was the FDA's top enforcement official. And earlier in his career, he served as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., and in the public integrity section of the criminal division at the Department of Justice. Howard and Shane, thank you so much. And Marc helping me for co-hosting this.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
And
It's a
so,
pleasure to be here.
Marc, I'm going to lead you off as a co-host.
okay,
Why should we listen to there's lots of talk about what this means and that means. Why do we need to pay attention to these two people?
because as a participant and observer of the cannabis industry, pretty much nobody really understands exactly what's going on process-wise, what's actually happening process-wise, and what's supposed to happen process-wise. There's an incredible amount of speculation and misinformation and just sort of hunches about the way things are supposed to work. I mean, that tends to be true throughout this industry with respect to federal policy, but particularly with a fairly arcane process that involves a lot of federal regulation of a number of different federal regulatory agencies. And so the reason why these two should be listened to is because they actually practice this. They know it. And so this is all to help shed light on, and clear up a lot of misinformation out there, misunderstanding of the process. So that's why I think, this is so valuable. And I look forward to learning something from them as well. So,
yeah, well, great. Well, so the way I think about it is we have an FDA expert and we have a DEA expert. And so let's just jump right in. And I'm going to start just almost at the end first. And I'll go with Shane first. What is your prediction for the next 12 months? Is cannabis rescheduled, descheduled, nothing happens? And why do you believe this? And when I say it's done, maybe the process has started or some version of that. What do you think will happen in the next 12 months and why?
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be talking with all of you. And yeah, it's always a thrill to get to talk with Howard about these things because he really was on the inside at FDA for so long at such a high level and still knows so much about what's going on. So I'm also looking forward to learning from him about this. My prediction for 12 months, I think that the relevant agencies, which are HHS, FDA, the Attorney General, DEA, and then some others that have to deal with the treaty related issues, are moving expeditiously. And I take Secretary Becerra at his word that by the end of this year we'll have HHS's recommendation on the proper scheduling of cannabis, and then also the medical and scientific evaluation that they're required to hand over to DEA will be sent over. It'll have run through the clearance process through the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health, and it'll be on DEA's desk by the end of the year. And then, from there, I think DEA will be, hard at work on getting its own analysis done and deciding what it's going to do on the treaty issues. I doubt within 12 months we'll have a final decision from the administrator, but I suspect that we will have a recommendation of Schedule 3 probably from HHS, which will carry a lot of weight at that point. Really, to deviate from it, DEA would need to probably pull the treaty card, I would imagine, to deviate from that. So we'll be well on our way, and we'll be probably in the process of doing notice and comment and or ALJ hearings, which are part of the process at that stage.
So before we go to Howard, that was awesome. There's a lot to unpack there. Before we go to Howard, why do you believe Schedule 3?
So Schedule 2 wouldn't be, so first of all, it looks like there's an appetite at the White House level to reconsider cannabis's Schedule 1 status. There are all the reasons that everyone knows that is an unpopular status. The fact that the president himself sort of asked for this is historically unprecedented, and the amount of political support at the state level and just nationally on sort of both sides of the aisle for some level of reform in this area, I think is very, very high. And so, I just think it's long overdue. And I think that the question is not if they're going to make a move, but where. And I think that when you get to that question, while it's very complicated, the short version of it is that Schedule 2 wouldn't really do much of anything. The only difference between Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 in general is, the penalties are still the same. What is legal and what is not is the same, with one exception, which has to do with, how easy it is to research the substance. It's a little bit easier to research Schedule 2 than Schedule 1. Turns out that even that difference is vanishingly small in the marijuana context because of a recent amendment to the Controlled Substances Act that actually made it so that the research restrictions are kind of cannabis specific. So arguably there wouldn't be really much of any difference at all if cannabis were moved to Schedule 2. And so in order to do something that they can get behind, meaning the relevant agencies and the administration can, claim as a win and actually kind of do what they set out to do, Schedule 3 would be the first really significant step, and it would be a very big one. Going further than that, they could, but it gets increasingly complicated to justify in terms of an explanation. as you make the change more dramatic. And I think that this is already a pretty dramatic change to move it to Schedule 3. And so that seems sort of like the Goldilocks, just right temperature porridge, not too hot, not too cold. And so that's kind of what I would predict. But look, you invited speculation, and I admit it is speculative at this stage.
Hey, before we follow up on that, I just want to jump in, and I should have said this at the beginning, but I'm still licensed as a lawyer, but I don't practice. But also then, for Shane and Howard's benefit, none of this is legal advice, and none of this is investment advice. I just want to throw that out there.
No.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Especially when it comes to cannabis. Howard. Okay, so what's your prediction next 12 months? What do you think will be in process or be happening, and why?
Well, first, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and it's always a pleasure to talk to Shane, who I've worked with, who is a real expert, both in terms of what he knows and his judgment, in my view, and partly because I agree with him. So therefore, he has great judgment. And no, this is definitely not legal advice, which I normally don't give legal advice on podcasts. So I just echoing kind of what Shane said. We'll start off with what I think almost certainly won't happen, which is that nothing happens, or that cannabis is descheduled. And the nothing happening is, to me, extremely unlikely because of the White House's interest in it. FDA has an ability to change its mind on this based on a whole bunch of legal and regulatory developments that have happened since 2016, when it last considered this issue formally. It now has an ability to consider things like real world evidence, which is how drugs work in the real world outside of just clinical trials before they're approved. I won't get into all the details, but they have an ability to rethink this that doesn't make them repudiate their process from years ago. And so I don't think that no change is likely at all. Descheduling would be extremely difficult for FDA to do. First, you have to bear in mind that the way FDA thinks, like many other agencies, and particularly FDA, is they're looking at a question not just in terms of that specific question, but in terms of how it affects their overall regulatory program and what precedent it sets. And FDA participates in the scheduling process largely not in the context of cannabis, but in the context of controlled substances that are approved drugs. And it has an office that does this and procedures that it follows, that it routinely follows when it's considering how to schedule a drug. Epidiolex is one drug, but there are many other drugs that are controlled substances. And FDA has to be careful to follow its rules and its precedents so as not to destabilize the rest of its regulatory program. And to deschedule, it would basically have to say that there's no abuse potential. And for a host of reasons, it's just extremely unlikely to do that. And so those are not going to happen. As far as the Goldilocks position, I think where I betting man, I think the most likely outcome would be Schedule 3, as Shane indicates. I agree, if you want to be results oriented about this, Schedule 2 would not really do very much. Schedule 3 would, in terms of the tax effects and other effects. FDA is not supposed to be result oriented, but there is a whole heck of a lot of difference between what it needs to find to get to Schedule 3 versus what it needs to find to get to Schedule 2. And so I think that is, to me, the most likely outcome. I think Schedule 2 is also a possible outcome. If I had to rank the outcomes, I would say Schedule 3 is the most likely, Schedule 2 is the second most likely, and then it gets, the probabilities get much smaller after that. I also agree with Shane on the timing. I think that this is not, people thought when this effort started, my goodness, it took FDA years in the past to do this. This is not on the normal timetable. They're aware of the importance of the issue, the interest of the issue, the White House's interest in the issue, and they're frankly aware of the election cycle and the administration's term coming to an end at the end of 2024. So I think all those things come together to mean that I agree with what Shane had said about the timetable.
What then is so let's say we have it goes to Schedule 3. You touched on the 280E issue, which if somebody could sort of, for viewers or listeners who are not familiar with what the result is with 280E, but if you could explain that, but also what are the other practical effects for the industry of how will it change plant touching operators' day-to-day business if cannabis is on Schedule 3 versus Schedule 1?
Howard, do you want to take either part of that?
I can start a little bit with the 280E, and I'll caution, I am many things in life. A tax lawyer is not one of them. But basically, under 280E, if cannabis is Schedule 1 or Schedule 2, you cannot deduct as ordinary business expenses many of the expenses that cannabis companies incur when going about their normal business operations. This makes the effective tax rate to run a cannabis business much higher than for typical businesses, which has a huge effect on the ability of businesses to survive and for new businesses to enter the market. Yes. And this is a very, very, very big deal, to use a technical term. Mm-hmm. And Shane, if you want to take some of the other questions.
Sure. So on its own, changing the scheduling status of cannabis from 1 to 3 at the federal level wouldn't do a heck of a lot apart from the 280E difference concretely or automatically to the day-to-day business of, cannabis operators under the various state legal regimes. Everything that was a crime would continue to be a crime. In fact, the sentences for most criminal violations would more or less be the same. Because again, those people have this idea that in general, the sentences for Schedule 1 related violations are stricter than those for Schedule 3. And while that is in general true, cannabis has its own specific special criminal violation laws and penalties that are associated with it that wouldn't change automatically. Like I said, there's a question about whether research would immediately be opened more. I think it would, maybe not immediately, but once people realize that this recent amendment that was supposed to make research easier, wasn't actually helping when cannabis moved to Schedule 3, I think that would be changed pretty quickly and pretty easily, I would imagine. But the main differences will be indirect differences or atmospheric differences, because as much as there might not be anything concrete in the federal law that would immediately change, the question is, how will other regulators and law enforcement officials at the state level and in the federal courts, for example, change their discretionary decisions with respect to cannabis related activity in light of such a historic move? And I think there are two things to consider there. One is, well, if the statutory classification at the federal level has relaxed in the historic way, led by a presidential administration making this unprecedented move, that would mean probably that they'll start treating cannabis more like other Schedule 3 substances, even if, with their discretion in terms of, do we bring charges? When do we bring charges? How much of an enforcement priority is this for our agency, et cetera? Those sorts of decisions would probably make life a little bit easier, to the extent that it can be, if you look at it on that perspective, in terms of how these regulators and law enforcement officials exercise their discretion. On the other hand, there's also something else that not many people have their eye on that I think is another factor here, which is, say I'm in a prohibitionist state and I have my own election coming up, and the federal government has just done something that loosens these standards at the federal level, and I want to make a statement about how tough on drugs we are here in whatever state it might be, right? There could be a backlash at the state level to some degree that would sort of counterbalance whatever softening of harshness and criminal penalties and prosecutions that you might otherwise see. And so it's very difficult to speculate about exactly how that will play out. But I think it will be those two changes, and how in what balance is anybody's guess.
And I think I agree with all of that. I think there is a symbolic effect to whatever decision is made in addition to the actual practical effect. And the fact is, if you talk about predictions, long term, whatever happens over the next year is one step in a process. And the legal landscape for cannabis regulation is going to look a lot different 10 years from now than it does in 2023 or than it will in 2024. At least that's my view. Just looking at just the raw politics of it. And also not just the politics, but the politics by age. And you think of what an electorate will look like 8 years from now or 10 years from now, and what their views will be on cannabis regulation. So I think one of the things that is sometimes frustrating for some of us who have worked as regulators before and work with regulated industry in the discussion about this is there sometimes is an approach that would be, I guess you'd say it's kind of all or nothing, which is if we don't get it descheduled now, then nothing else is worth it. And we're just going to kind of wrap our stuff up and go on and go on to another issue and just be upset about it. And gigantic changes, and this would be a gigantic change in important, difficult areas of regulation, almost never happen in one step. It's true of FDA regulation. It's true of almost anything else that's regulated. And I think this will be an important step in a longer process.
Howard, I mean, that's it. Before Aaron, sorry, Jeff, I could just jump in. I mean, that's an interesting point. And I've had that same discussion with a lot of people. And I think the counter to that, and this isn't to dismiss that point, but I think the legitimate counter to that is that the concern that if there's an incremental change, it's sort of then, all right, you get what you get and you don't get upset. Talk to me in 15 years. And so, there's a lot, the question is from a lobbying perspective, I guess, where is the industry lobbying? Where is the industry putting its efforts into if it can get anything from this government, or the federal government, what should it be aiming at? Because, versus, is it rescheduling? Is it better for the industry than safe, for example? But if you get safe, does that just lower the chances that, all right, well, that we gave the industry something and we're still letting them operate, even though it's completely illegal. So, talk to us, two administrations from now. I see both sides of that.
If I could respond to that, I mean, and I think that I'm a little bit different than Howard in this respect because, I spend a lot of time, working with cannabis companies on these issues and just not just companies, but also scientists, researchers, veterans groups, you name it, who are interested in reform. And I'm not saying Howard doesn't, but I don't think he's been doing as much of it as I have here recently. And I will tell you, the answer is yes, there is that concern about some sort of incremental change, right? That like we gave you something, now go away, right? But I think before you can really raise that as a problem, legitimately, in my view, and you need to have done everything you can to be getting every bit of every lever there is to try to move the ball forward. You need to be doing that. And the industry, and again, I'm a big reform advocate. I put a lot of pro bono and build time into these sorts of things. And so I've become a bit of a gadfly, I guess, but I think it's for good reason. And what I would say is if you want to be treated like other industries, start acting like other industries. You want to get involved and you want things to change for you. Stop just going and lobbying for the one thing over and over and over, and kind of getting in your own way. I mean, they've been very, very ineffective at this. And what they should be doing is what other industries do when they need a dramatic change to federal and state policy, right? They fight a multi-front battle that's very organized, where they go to the courts, to Congress, to the regulators at every level, and they don't just complain. They provide solutions teed up on a silver platter, right? And they bring the right people, they bring the right solutions. And look, this sounds like a lecture because it's a lecture I've given many, 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 many times. But just hear me out just for one more second on this. Like, look at like the pharmaceutical industry recently. There's an issue that's come up recently about drug pricing in Medicare that the pharma industry is very interested in. And I understand the pharmaceutical industry and the cannabis industry have very different like situations in every way, shape, and form. But just as an example, they've got the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and every organization you can imagine in front of every court right now and in front of Congress on that, up and down in the most organized way you could possibly imagine. It is a well-oiled machine. So if something's going to change in a way that is not exactly how they want it to be, it'll be like over their entire machine's dead body, right? And that is, now I understand the cannabis industry just doesn't have the resources right now to do that kind of a level of effort, but they are all the way on the other side. And so those concerns would fall, with more sympathy on my ears if we were out there. We should be in front of the State Department, the DEA, ONDCP, the White House, in Congress. We should be doing everything possible to get meetings and to try to like move this ball forward, putting up solutions. It's a fragmented industry too. We have lots of different folks kind of pushing in slightly different directions. They need to get over all that and start moving in an organized way. And so I know your question wasn't inviting the lecture, but it was close enough that it triggered my OCD need to give it every chance I get.
And my thought on that, and Shane's quite right. I don't work nearly as closely with the cannabis industry as Shane does, but I work with a lot of companies in the food and drug area, and I've worked with all kinds of stakeholders at FDA. Just a couple of examples from history. Go on the internet and look up healthcare reform proposals from the 1970s. And there were some proposals, they stopped short of the equivalent of Medicare for all, but there were some proposals to dramatically expand healthcare insurance coverage in the United States in the 70s. And they were killed by advocates on the left who said they didn't go far enough. And so healthcare reform basically died from then until the Affordable Care Act, with a couple of changes in the 90s and the CHIPS program and some others. The Food Safety Modernization Act, which revolutionized regulation of food safety, went into law in early 2011. That's an example the other way. There are a bunch of things that law did not do that a lot of advocates wanted, but it was a big step forward in the regulation of food safety. And there were stakeholders on both sides, industry, the food safety community, states. They came together and it passed, and it was a big step forward. And I think the perfect for the enemy of the good thing is a way that a lot of reform efforts simply die, or they go in the freezer for decades. And this issue is incredibly complex for people who want it to happen. And I mean, not put it beside people who don't.
Right.
All the considerations, if you're redesigning a regulatory system, you have laws from the 1970s that make a felony of a whole bunch of things. You want to change that, but you also want to protect the safety of products. You can't do that by flipping a switch. And rescheduling is an important part of it, but so is developing then a regulatory framework and a whole bunch of other things that replace it. It could be that it could be that it goes more just to the states and there's little federal role. Then there are questions about additives to food and all kinds of things. And you could come up with 20 difficult questions. So,
well, speaking of that, Howard, if we
yep.
dive in to the FDA and the role of the FDA, let's just keep going and say it does get through Schedule 3. It's rescheduled to Schedule 3. What is the role of the FDA? And is it the FDA that would regulate cannabis going forward? Would it be the Alcohol and Tobacco Trade Bureau? Would they have a role? And then I want to add to that, which is anyone really equipped to actually regulate the cannabis plants? And then sprinkle on top all the stuff that's going on with hemp. I just very curious of how, if this does go Schedule 3, how do you, who's in charge?
That's a complicated question with a superficially easy answer, and then a more layered answer. So the superficially easy answer is if it were rescheduled to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, FDA's authority over it would remain essentially unchanged. The same law, it still would be a controlled substance. The same laws that would, from FDA's perspective, prohibit it from being in the food supply or being in dietary supplements, those same laws would apply. It would not, the fact that it's an illegal food additive or an illegal additive to dietary supplements does not depend on its scheduling. It depends on the fact that FDA regards it as unsafe in those settings. That would not change by rescheduling. FDA's decision on whether to approve drugs that are derived from cannabis would not change. That is still governed by the safety and efficacy standard that's part of the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. So all that wouldn't change. And it is my view, and I think this is in my view, a misconception a lot of folks have in industry, which is that if it's rescheduled, that FDA would somehow use that as an opportunity to stamp out the industry. And I think that's a view that I not only just don't agree with, I almost don't even really understand.
They could do that now if they wanted.
Absolutely.
Can you elaborate on that? Because I hear this over and over again from people.
Right. So the authority right now, FDA has the authority today. First of all, DEA is the authority to shut down the entire industry, and DOJ does because it's a controlled substance. FDA has the authority to go after any food that's in interstate commerce that has cannabis in it, or something purporting to be a dietary supplement, or a whole bunch of other things, because those would be illegal additives under FDA statute. It could do that now. And rescheduling it to me, it's just defies logic that rescheduling a determination that it is a less risky product than it is now, the idea that would make FDA more willing to do that and to take those steps, to me, is just not a view that you can support. And the other thing really to think about, if you want to think like a regulator, regulators have a bunch of things ways they have to think that are not just one-offs. So when they're making regulatory decisions, they have to think, is somebody going to think we're being arbitrary in how we're enforcing something? So just to draw an analogy, take hemp-based CBD products, which are not controlled substances. FDA maintains that CBD is an unlawful additive to food and cannot be lawfully sold as a dietary supplement. The industry disagrees with that. FDA has issued warning letters regarding fraudulent health claims and things like that, disease care claims, but has not by and large gone after the hemp industry. Why? Well, from the perspective of a regulator, number one, if you go and do that, you're diverting resources from something else. And you are responsible as FDA for the safety of 80% of the US food supply. You're responsible for farms, for seafood, for interstate dairy, for everything in the freezer section, all that stuff. And you as a regulator are going to make a decision, okay, we are going to do fewer inspections. We're going to work with states less to inspect farms. We're going to do fewer inspections of seafood. We're going to do less work protecting Americans from dangerous imported food in order to go after CBD companies. And you want to be the regulator who makes the decision to reduce FDA food safety inspections. Good luck to you. And then number two is, how are you going to choose who to enforce against of the thousands of companies that do this? And if you're just going to randomly choose companies, that's kind of the definition of being arbitrary, which is what, and Shane's an administrative lawyer much more than I am. And he's smiling because, he'd be licking his lips at that. Just like, okay, we're going to just pick a company and make an example
of them. Yeah.
For no particular reason. That would be, from an administrative law perspective, a disaster. It would also be a public relations disaster, as that company would have congressmen. And for all these reasons, FDA, there are just not all these people sitting in a room in FDA like licking their lips, waiting to get into this thicket.
And
they've chosen not to for a reason.
Could I add to this? Because I'm so glad that Howard is here and saying that message, that he's put it out there before, because for good reason, people listen when he talks about the FDA. And I've been saying the same thing for so long. And I remember when we first started working together, I was like, I couldn't wait to ask him this, because I was so sure that this is the way it is, but nobody would believe me. And he's absolutely right. There's another thing I think people don't understand about the administrative process that's really important. And I mean, so much of what I do when I'm talking about this is just like schoolhouse rock for people who don't understand the administrative state, which is basically everybody who's not worked in it or familiar with it. A lot of people don't understand how this is. But when a change is made through legislation, like when Howard talked about the program, in 2011, that was an incremental but very significant step in the FDA world, that came with ways to fund it. Congress doesn't just, they have the power of the purse. They don't just haul off and change the world and then leave. Generally, they don't just haul off and change the world and then leave the agencies that are beholden to carry out their mandates without the resources, the staff, the money, the extraordinary amount of time and resources it takes to do this in a way that complies with the APA, is going to survive judicial review, match up with all the other priorities of the other agencies that are doing unbelievable complex work every day that we don't even know about, that never sees the light of day to most Americans. So that's not how it is with an administrative process. So like this scheduling review could change cannabis's scheduling status, but it's not going to change FDA's jurisdiction. And even if it did, it wouldn't give FDA any resources. There are no appropriations. There's no conditional spending, no increased user fees. None of the sources of FDA's money and staffing increase as a result of a DEA decision to transfer cannabis from one schedule to another. And to say that it would be very expensive to suddenly overnight, or even in any short period of time, take over the very, very intensive regulation that FDA does, extend that into a new industry like cannabis or hemp, that's an understatement, right? I mean, that would be a huge diversion of resources. It's not that like it's completely impossible, but why would they want to do that? What appetite do they have? And practically speaking, could they even, do that on a nationwide scale anytime soon? I just think people are wildly unrealistic when they think that somehow the Schedule 1 status of cannabis is protecting it from the federal government's reach. Nothing could be further from the truth. And there's nothing about being the most verboten status possible under federal law. An unapproved non-FDA approved Schedule 1 substance, you are in the pit of despair itself as far as federal status goes. It doesn't get worse than that. So you're moving out of that is a good thing. And the fact that we're having to convince people of that is kind of shocking. And I think I think that there is a legitimate concern down the line, right? Because here's something else people don't think about. If it were descheduled, it would still be subject to FDA jurisdiction. That doesn't seem to dawn on anyone either. The fact that this all or nothing idea that we're going to deschedule and then life will be good. Well, actually, then there is a tiny little difference where now DEA doesn't have jurisdiction, which makes FDA the sole central federal regulator of cannabis suddenly, right now, at least FDA has the excuse when it doesn't want to deal with it to say, well, this is a DEA matter, right? Because it's a controlled substance. You deschedule it, and now FDA is the only one that Grassley can haul in front of Congress to, ask as many legitimate questions about all of this, right? So these are things that just people don't think about.
I spent so much time at FDA when the agency was, and I was chair of the marijuana working group for a period, 2014 through early 17, when the agency was developing a lot of these policies. And so much of how FDA thinks when it's thinking of new authorities, and when people are proposing new authorities and Congress is asking, do you want these new authorities? Then very next question is, how are we going to use them? And if we don't have resources, we can't use them. So it's perfectly fine for you to say, go ahead and do X, Y, or Z. Well, then what do you want us not to do? And,
exactly.
No, that's really interesting. So I want to back up and I want to make sure that I'm hearing this correctly. And I want to use the hemp and the crazy stuff that's going on right now with like Delta 8 and the THC now by mail. Are you basically saying that because there's no dollars and authority and explicit instruction from Congress, that regulators are hesitant and don't have the tools to just effectively regulate the current hemp industry? And does that have implications if it goes to Schedule 3? Or do we just remain in this no man's land, so to speak? Or is it kind of, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'll answer that using, kind of FDA talk. I would say that it is a risk-based decision constrained by resources. So what that means is when FDA looks at the hemp and CBD industry, they say, okay, do we have the authority to do this, to start enforcing? Well, the lawyers at FDA would probably say, well, we think these products violate the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act when they're in food as an illegal food additive. We'd have to go to court. We could issue, warning letters and then go to court and litigate it. We think we'd win. The industry would fight it. But then the question FDA asks is, how, if there are public health risks, how do we rank them in terms of the other risks we face and we have to deal with given our resources? And the agency has made a collective decision. It says, CBD hemp products, according to the agency, have certain risks and it lists them on the website. Those risks, in the agency's view, pale in comparison to things like E. coli contamination in food, which it's using its resources to attack quite appropriately. And so it's then thinking like, okay, what is the public health bang for the buck in expending resources on this issue? And it's coming to the decision with CBD and hemp. Well, this is a very large industry. We can't just, if we're going to enforce, we can't just make an example of one company. We'd have to have a program that's going to then divert resources from other areas that pose a bigger public health risk. And that's how FDA thinks. In the cannabis area, Shane, I agree with Shane completely. I mean, if cannabis were descheduled, there would still be FDA regulation around its use in things like food or in claims that are made regarding cannabis. Just as an example, there is no exception in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for medical marijuana. Now, there's obviously Department of Justice. There are limitations in the appropriations language of the Department of Justice about taking enforcement steps against medical marijuana. But aside from the appropriations, FDA has not gone after medical marijuana. And medical marijuana, in FDA's perspective, is making claims to cure certain diseases that did not go through the new drug authorization process. New drug application process, but choosing not to do that for a whole bunch of reasons. And agencies decide when to act and when not to act, and they don't, they don't make those decisions lightly. At least usually they don't, and they haven't in this case.
And Howard, could I ask Howard a question that I think I know the answer to this question, but I want it to come out of Howard's mouth, both to confirm I'm right about it, and also because I think it's going to boggle people's minds if I'm right about this. It's fair to say also correct, Howard, that if if FDA, if a regulator like FDA, is casting its eyes across the cannabis landscape and it sees medical claims being made about a medical marijuana product, right? Mm-hmm. And then it sees people saying, we have adult use cannabis that adults can enjoy responsibly in a number of ways, and it advertises that, whatever. My suspicion is FDA, probably doesn't have a very high enforcement priority over either of those, situations. It's not necessarily going to want to change, those both things are being done, and it's not jumping out of its chair to go enforce against either one. However, if it had to choose one to go after, the medical marijuana claim would be the one to go after, right? Because it's a disease cure treatment claim.
Yes.
And the only have, right?
Yeah. So the difference between, if you want to think about this, policing disease cure claims is a core FDA activity. That FDA has been doing that for 100 years. And if you go back to the start of FDA, and you go back to Theodore Roosevelt's time and the early 1900s, there was FDA's poison squads, and it's all kind of snake oil being sold. That's in FDA's DNA. Yeah. Even before, frankly, they knew what DNA was. So in the early, way back. Now the difference, if you're talking about medical marijuana programs run by a state, the way FDA looks at that is, okay, those technically violate our statute, but there are state regulatory programs that are looking at the safety of these products in a certain way, and they're in a regulatory structure. And even aside from appropriations riders and politics and all this, there is a backstop there.
Right.
So we're not going to get into that. It would be entirely different in the CBD hemp area if somebody sells a CBD product and says, my CBD product cures Alzheimer's. FDA would go after that product, whether it was CBD or whether somebody sold yogurt that said cured Alzheimer's.
Right.
Or, when I was there, one of the things we did was there was a whole bunch of people selling products that purported to treat diabetes.
Yep.
And we say, no, these products do not do that. They're risking people's health because the products could be risky themselves, and it's diverting people from treatment. We had initiatives on sexually transmitted diseases. People had all kinds of things. We had bogus claims to treat all kinds of pandemics. And FDA looked at this with COVID, and there were a whole bunch of people being unfortunately creative in a fraudulent sense regarding COVID treatments. Yep. So FDA, that is a core thing FDA does, but it's a little different when there's a backstop and it's going through a state regulatory program.
And so,
gotcha.
if I could ask,
go ahead. No, I wanted to ask just practical. So when I look at what's going on with hemp and the mail order, and I think I understand, I want to really kind of dive into this, is that when I think about if we get to Schedule 3, and I'm looking into the future, and you have Schedule 3, you have no additional resources to the FDA. You have what you're talking about is the backstop of the state regulators. You have some maybe state regulators and governments that are like, we're going to swing the opposite way. Does this, and I want to ask this in a way, or however way you want to answer this, but it kind of sounds like de facto legalization in a way where they're like, until we get the resources and unless you see some reaction from FDA or the DEA, and maybe the Garland memo is involved in this somehow, but unless Congress gives more guidance or more enforcement or dollars, would Schedule 3 have the implications that the current environment with all the hemp and mail order stuff that's going on, would we just be in this situation, or how do you view it if you go out a year or two?
Well, FDA is a thought.
Yeah, go ahead, Howard.
Okay, so I'll start and then change up.
And it's FDA's more realistically, practically.
Yeah,
I understand
so the authority wouldn't change, and I don't think what FDA itself would do would change very much, because with respect to cannabis, if it were Schedule 3. FDA is not enforcing very much in the cannabis area now, and it would not enforce very much under a Schedule 3 regime. It is still true, however, you have a lot of states that do not allow recreational marijuana. It would still be true that if you're operating a business in states that don't allow it, you are at great legal risk if you are shipping it across state lines, and therefore outside of programs of states that do allow it. You're also at great legal risk. DOJ is more likely to take action if you're doing something that's not authorized by a state program, recreational or otherwise.
Yeah. And I would add too, I mean, I think, Aaron, maybe the way to sort of frame it a little differently, I think the big difference is that, the hemp-derived THC products that have sort of exploded and, you can now buy with a click over the internet, have shipped to you, those products are, they're in a sort of a questionable area, but they're maybe legal, probably legal. And so, and the states that have, the ones that allow for them, haven't said that they're illegal. And so there is sort of this patina of legality over it, which I think is different from why you're not going to see, maybe this is where you're going. If we change to Schedule 3, I still don't think you're going to be able to click and get shipped to you, non-hemp flower, because it's still Schedule 3.
That I understand. I'm more
and all the state laws. So I think that's sort of another way of looking at it. Of back to the point that these two have been making, which is that it's not going to change that much.
Let me try to just make my question a little. So it's not that I'm expecting like interstate commerce or mail order. Right now, you have a federally illegal industry, and that creates a tremendous amount of pressure to even someone like me. I'm a private investor. First Republic is now owned by JP Morgan. They no longer do cannabis banking because they used to, but now JP Morgan owns them. They don't do cannabis. Getting access to capital, even opening a bank account. There are all kinds of issues. Industry professionals have problems getting insurance. There's a lot of complications in the industry, and I'm wondering, maybe my question more is does making it Schedule 3 improve the operating landscape for the cannabis industry, in your opinion?
Can I answer this? Obviously, I agree with everything that Howard said. Also agree with Marc's comment. I just want to add that, first of all, you can't underestimate what removing 280E burdens would do in terms of freeing up cash flow. Then also you have now the administration engaging with cannabis and the industry and the data in a way that they historically haven't done. And what that means is that one reason, so we've talked about many reasons that FDA doesn't get involved, for example, like with the resources and so forth. But another resource that everybody's really light on with cannabis is just data and understanding the plant, all of its components. I mean, you saw Congress recently request information about CBD and other cannabinoids and how to regulate them, because the expert agency that they normally talk to, FDA, is not got all the data from a pharmaceutical company coming to them on that substance, because it's not approved. So they've never received that information. They've never regulated it. They don't frankly know enough about it to regulate it. So just changing the status of it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 doesn't get them any better off in that regard. But going through the process, for one thing, kind of does, right? They're going to get a lot of information through this process. They've obviously taken a deep dive probably recently on the most recent data. Every bit of this pressure that they're getting is making them have to learn more and sort of interface with the states and stakeholders. In the meantime, by loosening the restrictions at the federal level, I think there's a higher incentive for state attorneys general, for the state regulators to want to get a seat at the table with the federal regulators and start working on this, which, by the way, is the only way that you get more dramatic reform. So you have those two things, like the ease of research, ease of flow of data, interest from the regulators, interfacing at the state federal level, these sorts of things that as a result of the cannabis state federal policy gap have kind of not worked well in our system. We're sort of dusting them off, and they're going to start, those little wheels we're going to get the WD-40 out and grease them up, and they're going to start turning again. That's how government works. And it doesn't happen overnight, but over time, when the federal regulators start getting information, they're going to know more about how to regulate. And then they're going to be able to start informing Congress better. But until these things start happening, nothing changes, which is why the intoxicating hemp space is such a scary one from a certain perspective, right? Because once you look at that one, like basically the more that it goes unregulated, the more the likelihood that dangerous things start happening. And when dangerous things start happening, that's when FDA starts to have to like start prioritizing something, right? Because it is becoming more of a threat to public safety. And so I think these while they're still going to remain separate for a while, the hemp space and the regulated cannabis space are going to have to merge here at some point. Like they can't stay. It's a mirage that they're separate somehow. They're only separate because of an arbitrary legal classification. In time, they're going to have to be regulated together, one would think, one way or another.
So I have two other points that people bring up all the time when it comes to rescheduling or descheduling. One of them is the international treaties part that I think, Shane, I believe you've written about or commented on. And I'm wondering if you could comment just on that criticism, is that nothing will change because then we would violate international treaties.
Right. So I'm very much deeply involved in this issue as well on a number of different levels. But the basic idea there is that we would start violating the treaties, which would then be a problem. The problem of that argument is that we've been violating the treaties and are violating the treaties. And no matter what we do in this administrative process, we will be in violation of the treaties. So that is both an oversimplification of the problem, and it is a red herring. The real issue is, how do the responsible agencies, when now we're talking about the State Department, ONDCP, the White House, which is not an agency, but the White House also cares about this, and DEA because of its duties with respect to the treaties. How do they, if there's an appetite for them to change policy on cannabis and reschedule it, how do they sell that to the other agencies involved? And how does that affect the U.S. position on many other issues that we have to deal with in the treaty space? And so the first step there is making sure that DEA is on board, right? If they want to be on board with the change, it's very easy. You could put cannabis in Schedule 5 and just add regulations separately to make sure that treaty compliance is taken care of. That's what they did with Epidiolex at first before it was descheduled. They also did that with Marinol a long time ago. So you don't need cannabis to be in a particular schedule to get treaty compliance. It can be, that is something they can work around, right? The question is DEA inclined at all to do that? If instead they, are of the view that, no, we don't want to see any change happen and everybody else can go pound sand, then they can pull the treaty card and, try to use the treaties to say whatever HHS says about Schedule 3, et cetera. We can't move all cannabis to Schedule 3 because of the treaty. And then there would have to be litigation over that, if that is what they did. I hope it's not, but this is one of those things that I think anyone interested in this, should be lining up those meetings with DEA, ONDCP, the State Department, to try to start to get involved. If you wait until DEA's proposed rule comes out, which will be much later, to get involved in the process at that point, it could be too late, because by that time they will have already sort of talked amongst themselves, meaning DEA and the State Department and others, to get a view of this, and it will have been cleared, et cetera. It's much better if you have views about this to get in front of these agencies as soon as possible informally to try to get your view considered, and to maybe see if they'd have an audience with you to talk about their concerns, etc. And that's something important that I think anybody out there who is interested in seeing this actually happen, the treaties are kind of where it's at right now, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the next battleground that everybody should be paying attention to.
And then the other question that always comes up is on Schedule 3, you need a prescription, right, written by a doctor, and you have all these adult use states, obviously not coming with a prescription. What do you think about that issue of is that more of like an issue where it's I don't know whether that falls under the DEA's purview or the FDA of like, hey, people are selling it without a prescription, whether there's an enforcement or not. Like, how do you think about that?
So, Howard, I would be interested in hearing your views, but mine very quickly are basically everything that's illegal with cannabis in Schedule 1 or in Schedule 3 is also illegal with it in Schedule 1. So, it's impossible even to get a prescription for a Schedule 1 substance, which is why doctors aren't prescribing it, they're recommending it. And there's no reason that moving it to Schedule 3 would then suddenly make that recommendation any more illegal under federal law than it is now when cannabis is in Schedule 1. So, do you need a prescription under federal law you need a prescription for prescription drugs, as I understand it. And Howard, correct me if I'm wrong on this. But in general, it's just presumed that when a Schedule 2, 3, 4, 5 drug is approved by FDA, that they're putting prescription requirements on it. And with cannabis, because it's never been approved by FDA, they've never answered that question. And so presumably they wouldn't here either, because these drugs haven't been approved for marketing in interstate commerce. So instead, we would be in basically the same boat we're in now. It would be, illegal to prescribe it because there wouldn't be an approved drug product yet, but the recommendation would still be in the same status it was before in terms of a doctor recommending it to a patient. Howard, did I get that right? Or
100%. I agree 100%.
Well,
I always like to
that's
set
great.
my FDA related answers against Howard because he
knows
more about it.
I don't know if
you notice I didn't say a thing about treaties because I know about nothing about them. But
lucky man.
So let me add in. We're expecting also a Merrick Garland memo at some point. He said he's working on an updated Cole memo, but it would be a Garland memo of how the DOJ views cannabis or will interact with cannabis. And I saw, maybe I'm through rose-colored glasses, so correct me if you guys have any opinions on this, but the ATF just changed their hiring practices so that if you worked in a state legal plant-touching cannabis business, that no longer automatically precludes you from being hired by the ATF. Obviously, the ATF is a part of the DOJ. Really quickly before we end, what are your thoughts on a Garland memo and how that may interact with all of what we've discussed?
Howard?
So I think it would make stakeholders and others in the industry happy. But I think its effect would be more reassuring and psychological than real. I mean, because the fact is, the administration has operated since January 20th, 2021, without a Garland memo, and it's not going to all of a sudden change its enforcement posture because of a memo 3 years into the administration, and just. Again, historically, Bill Barr never issued a memo. He merely answered a question in a hearing saying it was not a priority of his. And Bill, to go after the industry. And Bill Barr, in case you didn't notice, is not a flaming lefty. And the Trump administration.
I did notice this.
Yeah. So, I think it's useful because I do understand and Shane and I deal with a lot of folks who are uneasy, but I don't think a Garland memo is necessary for the administration to maintain the posture it has now. And as far as any change, we'd have to see what's in the memo, but it hasn't gone after cannabis in a big way, and I don't think it will.
Yeah, and this is one of those things. And look, I don't have any inside information, and I know we're running out of time, but I'll just say I did clerk on the court that Garland was on as a judge when he was there, and met him and worked with his chambers and so forth. And he's a very influential judge, very good, I think, arguably one of the best judges out there ever, as far as I'm concerned. I often tell people, like, go find a Garland decision you disagree with and come explain to me why you do, and good luck to you, right? He's pretty good. So anyway, one thing you'll notice about him, though, is while he was a Democrat appointee and, he's considered, I think, a moderate liberal, I guess, politically, when it comes to crime and law enforcement, he is hardcore. And in fact, I've never found a single case where he ruled for a criminal defendant in his entire time on the judiciary. And I had looked into it very carefully at the time I clerked on the court for a number of reasons I won't get into. I haven't looked at it since, but if he did have a change of heart in his old age just before he left the bench and became attorney general, it'd be news to me. All that to say, kind of careful what you ask for with Garland. I mean, I love Merrick Garland. Don't get me wrong. I really do. But I don't think I think he's about as hard on crime and is little interested in loosening criminal laws as an attorney general, any other attorney general we've had, more or less. He's a law and order guy, and he's going to run the DOJ in a law and order kind of way, for sure. That's my impression of him.
And he grew up as an assistant U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia. There's my old office, doing things ranging from street crime to, I believe Oklahoma City.
Yep, he was the head of that.
So
I would throw out
he's tough.
I would throw out there, actually, I think one practical thing that could come from an actual sort of concrete change that could come from it is that you've got this is diving off into a different area, but just very briefly, interstate commerce. The state of California recently, they changed their law at the beginning of the year to say that if the DOJ says that they're not going to sue the state, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, for allowing for interstate commerce, then the state will allow interstate commerce. And they have been they've been petitioning, they and a few other states, been petitioning the DOJ for guidance to basically have the DOJ say, we're not going to be opposed to interstate commerce. And so if that showed up in the Garland memo, that could be a real practical change that could change the face of things. Other than that, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Howard and Shane that it's more just sort of a nice to have, but it doesn't really do much.
And I got to say, I mean, Howard, I'd love to know what you think. I mean, I don't see Garland doing that. I mean, my view would be he would be concerned about not so much state borders as the borders that border other countries, and what that would mean. And he's just going to be very careful about trying to say, yeah, just open it up, I would think. And I think it's because of, it's cartel situations and stuff.
I think what they're talking about is that it would allow them to enter into a distinct interstate commerce pact with another state.
Yeah.
So
it sounds very creative. It sounds like the kind of thing Merrick Garland would be like, I don't.
That's interesting.
But listen, I don't know him. I don't want to go too far with it.
I
just have studied his judicial decisions very carefully.
Gotcha.
And he is not creative or breaking new ground when he was a judge. He was just meticulous by the book.
And technically, correct me if I'm wrong, Shane, interstate compacts that actually have legal effect have to be approved by Congress.
That's right. And man, federal courts, that's way back there in my background somewhere. But yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to completely throw this
No. All of this is great. I want to thank you guys so much. You have been so generous with your time. This has been an incredible conversation. And the only request I would have is if your predictions come true, and God knows we don't know what exactly is going to happen, but if it does, we have news by the end of the year, I just personally would love to do this again to kind of review and just dive into the nuance, because this has been fantastic.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk with you guys, any and all of you, anytime about this stuff. So would love to.
Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate it. And thank you, Marc, for co-hosting this.
Thanks
Thanks,
a lot. Have a great
Bye-bye.
afternoon.